One of the challenges of writing the novels in the Age of the Kingdom series is the timeline. How old was David when he killed Goliath? How long had Saul been king on that eventful day? And the question I want to look at in this episode, how long did Saul reign altogether? The Old Testament really doesn't tell us that. It does take some detective work to find the answer, and there will be a surprise at the end. Let's dive in. If you're like me and you take the Bible seriously, you know it's important to work through some of the problems you run into when you're dealing with 3,000-year-old stories. The first two novels in my Age of the Kingdom series cover the reign of King Saul in the Bible. So how long was he on the throne? The Old Testament doesn't really say. There is a verse that appears helpful, which we'll look at in a minute. The Old Testament does tell us how long King David reigned. 2 Samuel 5 says he was 30 years old when he was crowned king and reigned for 40 years. 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. Many Bibles have dates at the beginning of chapters, but those dates were not part of the original text any more than the chapter and verse numbers. They were added later and are often somebody's educated guess. The chronology of the Old Testament events is not always easy to establish. A simple Google search will find conflicting timelines. I found one that had Saul's reign beginning in 1100 BC, and another just as certain that the date should be 1050 BC, 50 years later. Why are they so different? Well, in ancient times, there was no universal calendar. Each culture calculated dates in relation to the death of kings or some great calamity, so they were relative rather than being tied to an objective absolute. Making things worse, sometimes Israel counted the first year of a king's reign as any fraction of a calendar year when the king began his rule, and other times the first year of the reign was the full calendar year. So when it says in the first year of somebody's reign, it's not always clear when that was. Most Old Testament timelines are tied to the Assyrian king Sennacharib's siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC, because that date is well established by both the biblical record in 2 Kings and Isaiah and Sennacherib's own annals. Most other dates in the Old Testament are calculated in relation to that event, but that was 300 years after the events in my books. For my purposes, figuring out how long Saul reigned was more important than determining when he took the throne. 1 Samuel 13:1 appears helpful at first. Here is the New International Version. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. That seems very straightforward, but what's with the brackets? The NIV I'm using has an extensive marginal note on the two sets of brackets, and for good reason. Now let's compare the King James Version for 1 Samuel 13:1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. What? Why are they so different? The two translations seem to say completely different things. That's because the translators in both cases were trying to solve a problem in the original Hebrew of 1 Samuel 13:1. It may be that the ancient scroll was damaged and some words were missing. It turns out that the original Hebrew actually has no numbers at all, except for 2. The NIV and KJV arrived at very different solutions and very different meanings. Young's literal translation doesn't even try to make sense out of 1 Samuel 13:1. It just says, "A son of a year is Saul in his reigning, yea, 2 years he hath reigned over Israel." Where did son come from? The first Hebrew word in the text is ben, which means son in Hebrew. For example, Ben-Hadad was the name of a Syrian king in 1 Kings 21, and it means son of Hadad. Ben even means son in modern Arabic, as in Osama bin Laden. But Ben in Hebrew can also mean grandson, descendant, subject or citizen of a nation, child, young man, and much more. Ben can mean one individual, as in one should not jump to conclusions. However, I don't see anywhere that Ben can mean the number one, as seen in the King James translation. The number one in Hebrew is echad. The King James appears to be closer to the original Hebrew if you translate Ben as one instead of son. Is it possible that Ben refers to Saul's son, Jonathan, who is introduced in verse 2? But that introduces another problem. If Saul was 30 when he began to reign, like the NIV says, and had reigned 2 years, how could Jonathan be old enough to lead 1,000 soldiers? Even if Jonathan was born when Saul was 20, Jonathan himself would have been only 12, and it's doubtful he would have commanded 1,000 men at that age. Where did the NIV get 30 and 42 when the Hebrew has son and 2? The answer is from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament commissioned in Alexandria about 700 years before Christ. 1 Samuel 13:1 says, Saul was 30 years old and reigned for 42 years. Earlier versions of the Septuagint simply left out the problematic first verse, beginning chapter 13 with verse 2 instead, reasoning they didn't have enough information from a damaged scroll to properly translate it. Imagine my surprise when I pulled out my trusty Septuagint and couldn't find verse 1. Later scribes, maybe as late as the 1st century BC, must have decided to include verse 1 in the Septuagint and fix the problem by putting in numbers that were traditionally understood for Saul's total reign. 30 must have been a traditional number for the age of Saul when he took the throne, and 40 must have been a traditional number for the length of Saul's reign. But they had to include 2 with 40 because 2 was the only number actually in the Hebrew text. So late editions of the Septuagint have the length of Saul's reign as 42 years, and that found its way into many English translations. But age 30 and 40 years reigning are the same numbers 2 Samuel gives for King David. So that makes you wonder if they just took those numbers. All this means that while 1 Samuel 13:1 appears helpful in figuring out how long Saul reigned, it may not be helpful at all. By the way, if you're just getting started reading the Bible, there are links in the description below to 3 books that might be helpful. Some of my research for these books was in Jewish sources using the Masoretic Hebrew text, which is not concerned with Paul's sermon in Acts 13, so they estimate Saul's reign to be about 20 years. Indeed, the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus says it was 32 years from the death of Eli until the death of Saul. That's from Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 6. And that Saul reigned for the last 18 years of Samuel's life, then 2 years thereafter for a total of 20 years. 20 years for Saul's reign is attractive if you're only reading the Old Testament text, because if Saul was indeed 30 when he became king and reigned 42 years, he would have been 72 when he was killed in battle. In ancient times, it is questionable that he would have been vigorous enough at that age to have personally engaged in the battle. For a while, I tried to write these books with a shorter reign for Saul, but a shorter length of Saul's reign has its own problems. Like the fact I mentioned that Jonathan is full grown and leading battles himself after just 2 years of Saul's becoming king. What about the New Testament? The Apostle Paul preached a sermon in Pisidian Antioch, recorded in Acts 13, in which he states Saul's reign lasted 40 years. It is believed that the Septuagint is the version of the Old Testament scriptures that Paul quoted in his letters, so he may have just rounded it down from 42, knowing that 40 years was the traditional number. I finally decided the 40-year figure for Saul's reign was the only thing that made sense, not only because Paul said it, but because of an unexpected problem: the genealogy of the priests. The books in the Age of the Kingdom series, like 1 Samuel, span 5 generations of priests from Eli through Abiathar. Abiathar's father was Ahimelech. His father was Ahitub, and his was Phinehas, son of Eli. If Saul's reign was only 20 years, and it was 12 years from the deaths of Eli and Phinehas to the crowning of Saul, that only gives us Josephus 32 years for Ahitub, Ahimelech, and Abiathar. 32 years simply wasn't enough time for Ahitub to grow up, sire Ahimelech, who in turn had Abiathar. A 20-year reign for Saul would only give a total of 32 years for those 3 generations of priests. An obvious impossibility, since Abiathar was an adult at the end of Saul's reign. In the end, I decided these books needed to span 53 to 60 years, with Saul's reign taking 40 years. I hope this has been helpful, and if it has, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.